Part 1. A War Born in the Shadow of a Throne. Before I speak, I always look at the classroom, not at the blackboard, not at my notes, at the students. Because the 100 Years' War is not a story of dates and battles. It is a story of human ambition, of pride stretched over generations, of blood spilled for claims written on parchment. My children, I say, resting the chalk in my palm. Today, I will tell you about a war that lasted more than a century. And yet, even 100 years was not enough to exhaust the hatred that fed it. A question of a crown. Every great war begins with something small. This one began with a crown. In the early 14th century, Europe was not a continent of nations as you know them today. It was a web of families, bloodlines, marriages, and inheritance claims. Kings ruled not because borders said so, but because their ancestors once did. When the French king died without a male heir, the question arose, who would sit on the throne of France? Edward III of England believed the answer was him. His mother was a French princess. By blood, he claimed the crown. France disagreed. And here, this is where I pause and look at the room. History changes course. A disagreement between two men, I tell them, became a sentence of death for millions. In 1337, the French king confiscated English lands in France. Edward responded not with words, but with banners, armies, and steel. War had begun. A world built for war. Medieval Europe was ready for conflict. Violence was familiar. War was not an exception. It was an expectation. Peasants worked the land. Nobles fought. And God, it was believed, decided who would win. Knights rode into battle wrapped in steel, speaking of honor and chivalry. But under that armor were men who feared death as much as any other. England was smaller, poorer, but disciplined. France was rich, vast, and confident. And then England brought a weapon that would change everything. The longbow. An English peasant, trained from childhood, could loose arrows faster than a knight could charge. Distance no longer protected nobility. Birth no longer guaranteed survival. This, I say, tapping the board, is the moment the old world began to crack. Crécy. The death of chivalry. In 1346, the armies met at Crécy. The French knights rode forward in shining armor, convinced that courage and lineage would carry the day. The English stood their ground, bows drawn, silent. Then the sky darkened. Arrows fell like rain. Horses screamed. Knights fell. Mud swallowed men who could no longer rise beneath the weight of their armor. Nobles died alongside common soldiers, indistinguishable in the chaos. Crécy was not a battle of honor, it was a slaughter. And when it ended, the fields were littered with the bodies of France's finest. That day, I tell my students quietly, Europe learned that armor does not stop progress. The forgotten victims. But do not make the mistake of thinking this was a war of kings and knights alone. The true victims had no banners. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock stolen. Armies marched through the countryside like storms, leaving famine in their wake. A village could wake under French rule and sleep under English boots. To the peasants, it made no difference. Every soldier demanded food. Every army took what it needed. Many did not die in battle. They died hungry. I write one sentence on the board. War feeds on the powerless. The Black Death, a war within the war. And then, as if human cruelty were not enough, death arrived without armor or allegiance. The plague. In 1348, the Black Death swept through Europe. Cities emptied, churches filled, entire families vanished. People believed it was God's punishment. Others blamed foreigners, witches, or the poor. Fear spread faster than disease. The war slowed, but it did not stop. Too many had already invested too much blood, and yet the plague changed everything. Labor became valuable. Peasants gained leverage. The old social order weakened. A war, I say, does not end when swords fall silent. It ends when society is no longer the same. An unfinished beginning. By the time this first phase of the 100 Years' War ended, nothing had been resolved. No crown was secure, no hatred satisfied, no peace permanent. Generations would inherit this conflict. Sons would fight battles their fathers had started for reasons they barely understood. I set the chalk down. This, I conclude, was only the beginning. Because before this war could end, it would need to break kingdoms, erase cities, and eventually place the fate of France in the hands of a teenage girl. Part 2. Knights, Arrows, and Broken Honor. I begin this lesson standing rather than sitting. Some stories should not be told from a chair. You must understand, I say, slowly pacing before the blackboard, that wars do not grow longer because they are fierce. They grow longer because they refuse to resolve. After Crécy, Europe should have learned its lesson. It did not. Instead, the 100 Years' War hardened. It became less about kings and more about survival, less about honor and more about endurance. And in this transformation, something ancient and proud began to rot. Poitiers, when a king fell. 10 years after Crécy, the French believed they had adapted. They reorganized. They raised new armies. They told themselves that the disaster had been a mistake, not a warning. In 1356, near the town of Poitiers, the French army met the English again, and there the unthinkable happened. The French king, John II, was captured. A king taken prisoner on the battlefield. For medieval Europe, this was more than defeat. It was humiliation. A king was meant to be God's representative on earth. If God allowed him to be captured, what did that say about divine order? France was forced to pay an enormous ransom. Taxes rose. The countryside groaned. War, I tell my students, does not always destroy a nation at once. Sometimes it bleeds it slowly. The long bow and the end of the night. By now, the lesson was clear. Armored cavalry could not dominate the battlefield anymore. But knights refused to accept it. They continued to charge. They continued to die. The longbow did not care about family names. It did not respect coats of arms. It rewarded discipline, training, and patience, qualities often found not in castles, but in villages. This war marked the slow death of feudal warfare. Steel yielded to wood and string. Lineage yielded to skill. This, I say quietly, is where the medieval world begins to lose its authority. The war between wars. Yet the 100 Years' War was not one continuous conflict. It came in waves, periods of violence followed by uneasy truces. But peace was fragile. Mercenaries roamed the countryside during truces, unpaid and hungry. They formed bands known as free companies, robbing and killing without allegiance. To the peasants, peace felt no different from war. Houses were burned by men wearing no banners. Roads became graves. History remembers treaties. People remember hunger. England's hollow victories. England, despite its battlefield success, began to feel the strain. Wars cost money. Arrows did not grow on trees, and soldiers did not march for ideals alone. Taxes rose. Discontent spread. England's victories were impressive, but empty. They held territory they could not fully control among people who did not want them. A conqueror, I tell the class, who cannot become legitimate must remain violent, and violence, once normalized, devours its own creators. France breaks from within. France suffered even more. With its king captured, its nobility disgraced, and its economy strained, rebellion followed. In 1358, peasants rose in revolt. The jacquerie was brutal and short-lived. Nobles crushed it mercilessly. Thousands died, not because they lost a battle, but because they dared to protest. The war had created a society where violence was the first answer to every question. Honor becomes a costume. Knights still spoke of chivalry, but chivalry had become theater. Ransoms were more valuable than mercy. Captured nobles were kept alive, not out of kindness, but because they were profitable. Common soldiers were slaughtered without thought. Honor, I say, is what remains when fear is absent. In this war, fear ruled everything. The treaty that changed nothing. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny was signed. England gained vast territories. France paid dearly. On parchment, it looked like peace. In reality, it was only exhaustion. The hatred remained. The claims remained. The wounds festered. Children born during this treaty would grow up to fight again. I stopped speaking and let that settle. A war inherited. This is something students often fail to grasp. Most soldiers in the 100 Years' War did not know why it had begun. They only knew it had always existed. Fathers trained sons. Villages prepared for armies the way others prepared for winter. War became background noise. This, I tell them, is how violence survives generations. The fading of the old world. By the end of this phase, something fundamental had changed. Knights were no longer kings of the battlefield. Castles were no longer untouchable. Peasants were no longer invisible. Europe was changing, slowly, painfully, and yet the war refused to die. I write on the board, "A war without resolution becomes a habit." Then I turn back to the class. Part 3. Plague, Peasants, and Burning Lands. By the time I reach this part of the story, I no longer pace the room. I sit, not because I am tired, but because this chapter is not about movement. It is about collapse. Up to now, I tell my students, you have seen how kings failed, how knights fell, and how war became routine. Now you will see what happens when a society can no longer carry the weight of endless violence. A land that could no longer heal. France in the late 14th century was a wounded body that never stopped bleeding. Fields lay fallow not because peasants were lazy, but because there were no peasants left to work them. Villages stood abandoned, their wells poisoned, their churches roofless. Armies passed through like migrating disasters. English forces burned crops to starve the enemy. French forces did the same when reclaiming territory. Mercenaries finished whatever remained. War no longer followed strategy. It followed hunger. I pause and add quietly, when survival becomes uncertain, morality becomes optional. The plague returns. Just as the land tried to recover, the plague returned. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Every decade it resurfaced. Children watched parents die. Parents buried children. Priests ran out of prayers. The Black Death did not discriminate, but fear did. Jews, foreigners, the poor, anyone could become a target. People needed someone to blame. History, I tell my students, shows us that when people are afraid, truth becomes expendable. Peasant life in a world at war. You must understand what life was like for the common people. A peasant owned nothing but labor. When war destroyed the land, labor became useless. Hunger followed. Disease followed hunger. Some fled to towns. Others joined roaming bands. Many simply vanished from records, erased by famine or plague. This war did not only kill bodies, it erased names. We know the kings, we know the battles, but we do not know the millions who died silently. That, I remind them, is history's greatest failure. The sound of fire. By the early 1400s, France had become accustomed to fire. Villages were burned so often that people stopped rebuilding properly. Wooden homes replaced stone. Why build for a future that might not exist? The English controlled much of northern France. Paris itself was often unsafe. Trade collapsed. Trust collapsed. A generation grew up knowing only war. These people, I say, did not remember peace. They imagined it. England's slow decline. England, too, began to fracture. The war had drained its treasury. Nobles fought among themselves. Political instability grew. The victories of earlier decades no longer mattered. Holding France was expensive. Losing it would be humiliating. So England continued, out of pride more than purpose. This, I explain, is how wars survive logic. Faith-tested religion was everywhere in medieval life, but war tests faith brutally. People prayed for victory, for rain, for healing. Often, none came. Some grew fanatical. Others lost belief entirely. Movements arose claiming the end of the world was near. When institutions fail, kings, armies, even churches, people search for meaning anywhere, sometimes in dangerous places. France on the edge of disappearance. By 1420, France was nearly finished. The Treaty of Troyes declared that the English king would inherit the French crown. France, in effect, agreed to erase itself. The French king was broken, the nobility divided, the people exhausted. I look at the students and say, this is the moment when history should have ended for France. And yet, it did not. The silence before the voice. Here, I stop speaking for a moment, because something extraordinary was about to happen. Not a new army, not a new weapon, not a clever treaty, but a voice from a village, from a peasant family, from a teenage girl. History, I tell them, sometimes waits until everything is lost just to prove that it is not. I stand again. In the next part, I say, we will meet a figure who did not belong in war, did not understand politics, and yet changed the course of a century. And I add softly, hope rarely arrives in armor. Part 4, Joan of Arc and the Return of Hope. There is a moment in every long war when people stop believing not only in victory, but in meaning itself. France had reached that moment. I stand very still when I begin this part, because this is where history becomes fragile. One careless sentence can turn this into legend or mockery, and Joan of Arc deserves neither. She was not born for war, I say, and yet war was waiting for her. A girl from nowhere. Joan was born in 1412 in a small village called Domremy. No noble blood, no education, no weapon training. She could not read, she could not write. She knew nothing of strategy or diplomacy. What she knew was soil, sheep, seasons, and prayer. And then voices that told her France would fall unless she acted. Now, students always lean forward here. They want me to say whether the voices were real, divine, imagined. I never answer that question. Instead, I say this: history is not written by the truth of visions, but by the consequences of belief. A broken kingdom. At this point, France barely existed. The English controlled Paris. Burgundy had allied with England. The French king, Charles VII, was a shadow hiding in the south, unsure even of his own legitimacy. The people were exhausted, defeated, cynical. And into this despair walked a teenage girl claiming God had sent her. Normally, history would have laughed and buried her quietly. But France was out of alternatives. Meeting the King, Joan traveled through enemy territory to meet Charles VII. Imagine that journey. A young girl, no escort worth mentioning, a country torn apart by war, roads haunted by mercenaries. She arrived at court dressed simply, speaking with certainty. She told the king she would lift the siege of Orléans and crown him rightful ruler of France. He tested her, questioned her, tried to expose her as a fraud. She did not falter. She spoke, I tell my students, with the confidence of someone who does not doubt being heard. Charles, desperate and hesitant, gave her armor and an army. Orléans, the impossible victory. Orléans was surrounded by English forces. If it fell, southern France would collapse. Joan arrived in 1429. She did not command like a general. She inspired like a force of nature. She stood where arrows fell. She carried a banner, not a sword. She spoke of faith, destiny, and courage. Against all expectation, the French attacked, and they won. The siege was lifted. For the first time in decades, France did not retreat. I pause here, letting that sink in. Hope, I say, is a military resource no strategist can calculate. A nation awakens. Word spread fast. A girl had defeated the English. Soldiers followed her willingly. Peasants whispered her name like a prayer. Even hardened commanders felt something shift. Joan pushed forward, always forward. Within months, she escorted Charles to Reims, the traditional coronation city of French kings. There, he was crowned. France had a king again, and, more importantly, France believed in itself again. Why she worked. Students often ask why Joan succeeded where armies failed. The answer is uncomfortable, because she reminded people what they were fighting for. Not land, not taxes, not treaties, identity. She turned a political war back into a human one, captured by politics. But war is cruel to symbols. In 1430, Joan was captured, not by the English, but by Burgundian allies, sold, handed over. The English did not kill her as a soldier. They tried her as a heretic, because killing her body was not enough. They needed to destroy her meaning. The trial. The trial was a performance. The verdict decided in advance. Joan was interrogated relentlessly, trapped by theologians, lawyers, men trained to twist words. She stood alone. She never denied her voices. She never begged. She answered, I say quietly, with the calm of someone who had already accepted the cost. The fire. In 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. She was 19. The English hoped her death would end her power. They were wrong. Martyrs do not disappear. They multiply. After the fire, France continued the fight, slowly, relentlessly. The English lost territory, alliances collapsed, momentum faded. Joan never commanded another battle, but her impact outlived every general of the war. I look at the class. This, I tell them, is why history fears belief more than weapons. A turning tide. By the mid-15th century, France had reorganized. It built a standing army, used artillery, centralized power. England, weakened by internal conflict, could not keep up. The war was ending, but endings, like beginnings, are rarely clean. I close my book. In the final part, I say, we will talk about how this war ended, not with triumph, but with transformation. Because when the 100 Years' War finally ended, the medieval world ended with it. Part 5. The end of a war, and the world it left behind. When I reach the end of this story, I always slow down. Not because the facts are complicated, but because endings demand responsibility. This war lasted so long that it outlived the people who began it, and shaped the lives of those who never understood why it started. The 100 Years' War, I say to my students, did not end with a single battle, a single treaty, or a single moment of celebration. It ended the way long suffering usually ends, quietly, unevenly, and with consequences no one fully understood at the time. The war winds down. After Joan of Arc's death, France did not collapse. That in itself tells you everything. Her execution failed to break French morale. Instead, it hardened it. The English were slowly pushed back, not by miracles now, but by organization. France learned. It created a standing army, loyal to the crown rather than feudal lords. It invested in artillery, cannons that could shatter castle walls that had once seemed eternal. Castles, the symbols of medieval power, became obsolete. I let that thought linger. A single innovation, I say, can erase centuries of certainty. By the 1440-50s, English control of France had shrunk dramatically. Normandy fell. Paris returned to French hands. One by one, English strongholds disappeared. England turns inward. England, exhausted and divided, could no longer sustain the war. The cost had been immense. Taxes angered the population. Nobles fought among themselves for power and favor. Soon, England would descend into its own conflict, the Wars of the Roses. Empires often collapse, not when defeated abroad, but when fractured at home. This, I tell the class, is one of history's cruelest patterns. 1453. The end that didn't feel like one. In 1453, the English lost Bordeaux, their last major stronghold in France. The war was over. No great announcement, no grand ceremony, no victory parade that matched the scale of suffering, just an end. England retained only Calais for a time. France emerged battered, scarred, but sovereign. After 116 years, the fighting stopped, and the world realized it had changed. What the war destroyed. The 100 Years' War destroyed the medieval order. Feudalism weakened. The idea that a noble's duty was military service in exchange for land began to fade. Knighthood, once romanticized, was exposed as obsolete. Armored cavalry could not withstand gunpowder and disciplined infantry. The church's authority cracked. Too many prayers had gone unanswered. Too many priests had failed to protect their people. Faith remained, but it was no longer unquestioned. What the war created. From the ashes came something new. National identity. Before this war, people were subjects of lords. After it, they were French or English. Language replaced Latin. Kings centralized power. Bureaucracy replaced tradition. Modern states began to form, not because people wanted them, but because chaos demanded order. The modern world, I say, was born not from progress, but from necessity. Joan's legacy, revisited years after her death, Joan of Arc was retried. This time she was declared innocent. Later still, she was canonized as a saint. But her true legacy is not religious or political. It is psychological. She proved that history can pivot on belief, that even in the darkest moments, conviction can reshape reality. She did not end the war. She made ending it possible. The uncounted dead. We estimate millions died during the 100 Years' War. But numbers fail here, because most of the dead were never recorded. Peasants, children, farmers, travelers caught between armies, victims of famine and plague that followed soldiers like shadows. History remembers kings. It forgets the cost. And that, I remind my students, is why history must be taught carefully. What this war teaches us. I close my book, not dramatically, just gently. This war teaches us, I say, that conflicts rarely last because they make sense. They last because stopping them is harder than continuing, because pride resists peace, because leaders fear weakness more than loss, because people grow used to suffering, and because hope, when it finally arrives, often comes from places no one expects. The final silence, The 100 Years' War ended nearly 6 centuries ago, but its lessons are uncomfortably familiar. Borders still shift. Belief still mobilizes nations. Technology still outpaces morality. I look around the room one last time. History, I say, does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers. And then, as always, I end the lesson the same way. Your responsibility is not to memorize dates. It is to recognize patterns. Because wars do not begin with swords. They begin with stories people refuse to stop telling.